The bonds of family are meant to be our greatest strength, a sanctuary from the harshness of the world. But what happens when that sanctuary becomes a prison? What happens when the lines of love, loyalty, and desire become so horribly blurred that they lead not to comfort, but to a darkness so profound it consumes everything? The story you are about to hear is a harrowing journey into the heart of a shattered family, a tale of forbidden passion that escalates into an unforgivable sin. It challenges our deepest notions of love and asks a terrifying question. Is there a line from which there is no return? Before we pull back the curtain on this domestic tragedy, if you are drawn to stories that explore the complexities of the human psyche and the shadows that can lurk behind a perfect facade, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the depths we're about to explore. Now, let us begin. The Sterling residence was a monument to curated perfection. Perched on a manicured hill in the affluent suburb of Northwood, the house was a sprawling contemporary masterpiece of glass, steel, and pale limestone. From the outside, it spoke of success, of order, of a life lived without compromise. Inside, the aesthetic was the same, minimalist, immaculate, and cold. Every piece of furniture was an architectural statement. Every surface gleamed under the recessed lighting, and the air hummed with the silent, efficient purr of a state-of-the-art climate control system. It was less a home and more a gallery, and its primary curator, Helen Sterling, ensured that every exhibit was flawless. Helen herself was as polished and formidable as her surroundings. A high-powered corporate attorney, she moved through the world with an air of unshakable confidence and razor-sharp intellect. Her life was a series of strategic victories, both in the boardroom and in her personal life. She was beautiful in a severe, sculpted way, her blonde hair always perfectly coiffed, her designer outfits impeccably tailored. She loved her daughter, Maya, with a fierce, proprietary love the same way she loved her Italian sports car and her collection of abstract art. Maya was another of her prized possessions, a reflection of her own success. A beautiful, intelligent daughter destined for an Ivy League education and a life that would further cement the Sterling legacy of excellence. Maya, at 17, felt less like a daughter and more like the gallery's most scrutinized exhibit. She had her mother's blonde hair and high cheekbones, but where Helen's eyes were a cool, calculating blue, Maya's were a deep, stormy gray, windows to a restless and turbulent inner world that her mother refused to acknowledge. She was a quiet, introspective girl, with a mind that gravitated towards poetry, philosophy, and the messy, complicated truths of the human condition, all things Helen dismissed as unproductive navel-gazing. Life in the Sterling house was a constant, low-grade performance. Maya was expected to achieve perfect grades, excel at cello and tennis, the right extracurriculars, and maintain a social circle comprised of the sons and daughters of her mother's equally successful peers. She was a doll in a meticulously crafted dollhouse, and she was suffocating. Her father had been a casualty of her mother's ambition years ago, a gentle, academic man who couldn't keep pace with Helen's relentless drive. He had faded out of their lives, relocating to a quiet university town on the other side of the country, his presence reduced to biannual phone calls and birthday cards that always arrived a day late. In his absence, the silence in the vast house had grown, a palpable entity that Maya filled with the melancholy notes of her cello and the whispered words of the poets she kept hidden under her mattress. The dynamic of the gilded cage shifted dramatically the summer Maya turned 16, with the arrival of Mark. Mark was Helen's new husband, a man who seemed, at first, entirely out of place in their sterile world. He was a landscape architect, a man with earth under his fingernails and a warmth that the house had never known. He was handsome in a rugged, approachable way, with kind, crinkling eyes and an easy laugh that seemed to momentarily startle the silence into submission. Helen had met him through a client, and after a whirlwind, high-powered romance, they were married. To Helen, he was another perfect acquisition. Successful in his own right, charming, and a decade her junior, a testament to her enduring allure. To Maya, Mark was a breath of fresh air in a vacuum. Unlike her mother, he seemed to actually see her, He didn't look at her and see a future CEO or a society wife. He saw a 17-year-old girl. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answer. He noticed when she was sad, a feat of perception that her own mother had never mastered. He was the first person to ask about her poetry, to read one of her verses and not critique its structure, but to talk about the feeling it evoked. Their connection began in the small, shared spaces of their lives, in the quiet moments that Helen was too busy to occupy. Started in the kitchen late at night. Maya would come down for a glass of water, unable to sleep, and find Mark sketching designs at the massive marble island, a mug of tea steaming beside him. Their conversations were tentative at first, whispers in the sleeping house. He told her about his passion for creating gardens, for shaping wild spaces into places of beauty and tranquility. She, in turn, found herself opening up in a way she never had before, sharing her frustrations with her mother's expectations, her fears for the future, her secret dream of being a writer. Mark never took her side against Helen, not explicitly. He was too clever for that. Instead, he offered a quiet, unwavering validation. "Your mother just wants the best for you," he'd say, his voice a soothing balm. "But you have to find your own path, Maya. Your voice is too powerful to be silenced." He became her champion, her confidant, the only person in her life who seemed to understand the complex machinery of her soul. He was the father figure she had always yearned for, a steady, gentle presence in the emotional wasteland of her home. The bond deepened over a shared love for the arts. Helen's taste was modern, abstract, and expensive. Mark and Maya, they discovered, were drawn to the romantics. They would talk for hours about Keats and Shelley, about the sublime and the beautiful, about the power of passion to transcend the mundane. He bought her a leather-bound edition of her favorite poems for her 17th birthday. Helen had given her a new laptop and a portfolio of stock options. The contrast was not lost on Maya. Her mother gave her tools for success. Mark gave her food for her soul. Helen, far from being suspicious of their growing closeness, encouraged it. In her mind, it was the ideal scenario. Her new husband was successfully bonding with her daughter. It was a testament to her excellent judgment, another flawless component of her perfect life. She would see them talking and smile, pleased that her family unit was operating so efficiently. She was completely oblivious to the nature of the bond being forged right under her nose, a bond that was slowly, subtly, beginning to transgress the boundaries of a paternal relationship. The shift was almost imperceptible at first. A lingering touch on her arm as he passed her in the hallway. A shared gaze across the dinner table that held a little too long, charged with an unspoken understanding. The compliments that slowly changed from, "You're such a smart young woman," to, "You have the most beautiful, soulful eyes." Maya, starved for affection and validation, drank it all in like a desert traveler finding an oasis. She began to live for these small moments, for the secret smiles and the late-night conversations. Her world, which had once been a muted landscape of gray obligation, was suddenly filled with vibrant, terrifying color. She started to see Mark not as a father, but as a man. She noticed the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders when he worked in the garden, the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the low, intimate timbre of his voice when he spoke to her. And she began to feel a confusing, exhilarating mix of emotions. Gratitude, admiration, and a deep, unsettling longing. She told herself it was a crush, a silly, harmless infatuation with the first kind man who had ever paid her any real attention. But deep down, she knew it was something more, something dangerous. The forbidden nature of her feelings only made them more potent. Her mother became the unwitting antagonist in the secret drama unfolding in Maya's heart. Every demand Helen made, every criticism she leveled, every moment she monopolized Mark's time, felt like a deliberate act of cruelty. She began to see her mother not just as controlling and emotionally distant, but as a barrier, an obstacle standing between her and the only person who had ever made her feel truly alive. A quiet, simmering resentment began to take root in her soul, a dark seed nourished by her secret, impossible love. The turning point, The moment the unspoken became undeniable happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Helen was in Zurich for a week-long conference. The house, usually just quiet, felt cavernously empty without her formidable presence. Maya and Mark had ordered pizza and were watching an old black-and-white film in the cavernous media room. It was a film noir, a story of doomed lovers and dark secrets, and the moody, atmospheric tension on the screen seemed to seep into the room. During a particularly dramatic scene, Maya, caught up in the story, shivered. "Cold?" Mark asked, his voice a low murmur beside her in the dark. Without waiting for an answer, he draped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her slightly closer. The gesture was simple, possibly innocent, but it sent an electric jolt through Maya's entire body. His warmth enveloped her, the scent of his colonna sandalwood and rain filling her senses. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart through the fabric of his shirt. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her own heart hammering against her ribs. This was wrong. This was a line she should not cross. But it felt so profoundly, achingly right. They sat like that for a long time, the dialogue of the film a meaningless drone in the background. The real drama was happening in the silence between them. When the credits rolled and the screen went black, Mark didn't move his arm. He turned his head slightly, his face now only inches from hers in the dim light. "Maya," he whispered, and her name on his lips was a caress. His eyes searched hers, and in their dark depths, she saw her own forbidden longing reflected back at her. The world seemed to contract, shrinking down to this single, heart-stopping moment. The vast house, her demanding mother, the entire outside world, it all faded away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a bubble of impossible, terrifying intimacy. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But she was paralyzed, caught in the magnetic pull of his gaze. She didn't want to pull away. She wanted this more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. His lips met hers, tentatively at first, then with a deepening, desperate hunger that she matched with her own. The kiss was a cataclysm, shattering the last remnants of her innocence and demolishing the carefully constructed walls of their appropriate relationship. It was a kiss that sealed their secret and, in doing so, sealed her mother's fate. In the silent, opulent darkness of the house her mother had built, a monstrous love had just been born, and it would demand a blood sacrifice. The aftermath of the kiss was a maelstrom of guilt, exhilaration, and terror. For Maya, it was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging her world into a new, dangerous, and intoxicating reality. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. The relationship that had once been a source of comfort and validation was now a source of a burning, all-consuming obsession. Every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of Mark, by the memory of his touch, by the terrifying, thrilling secret that now bound them together. When Helen returned from Zurich, the house immediately reverted to its state of high-alert order. Her formidable presence filled every room, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The atmosphere, which had been relaxed and intimate in her absence, became tense and charged. Maya and Mark were forced to become actors, performing their roles as dutiful daughter and devoted husband with a new, desperate intensity. The stolen glances, the secret smiles, the brief, accidental touches in the hallway, these became their clandestine language, a silent conversation happening right under the nose of the woman they were both betraying. The risk, the constant threat of discovery, acted like a potent accelerant, fanning the flames of their forbidden affair. Their secret meetings became more calculated, more daring. When Helen worked late, which was often, the house became their sanctuary. They would talk for hours in the library, surrounded by the silent, leather-bound witnesses of Helen's intellectual vanity, their voices low whispers against the backdrop of the ticking grandfather clock. The physical aspect of their relationship deepened, moving from a single, cataclysmic kiss to a series of frantic, desperate encounters in the guest rooms, in the pool house, anywhere they thought they wouldn't be discovered. Each tryst was a reckless gamble, a dance on the edge of a precipice, and the danger only served to heighten the illicit thrill. Maya's entire existence was reoriented around Mark. Her schoolwork, once a source of pride, became a tedious chore. Her friends, with their trivial dramas about proms and college applications, seemed like children from a different, simpler world. She saw them through a haze of condescension, pitying their innocence. They couldn't possibly understand the profound, transgressive love she was experiencing, a love that she had convinced herself was a meeting of souls, a fated connection that defied conventional morality. She began to construct a powerful narrative to justify her actions, a narrative in which she and Mark were the romantic protagonists, and her mother was the cold, unfeeling villain. Helen's every action was filtered through this new, distorted lens. When her mother pushed her to study for her SATs, it wasn't parental concern. It was a cruel attempt to control her and keep her from Mark. When Helen planned a weekend getaway for her and Mark, it wasn't a wife trying to connect with her husband. It was a calculated move to tear them apart. In Maya's mind, Helen was no longer her mother. She was a jailer, the architect of the gilded cage, and Mark was her fellow prisoner, her partner in a silent rebellion. Mark, for his part, was a masterful manipulator, subtly reinforcing Maya's warped perception of reality. He never spoke a harsh word against his wife. Instead, he would sigh, a picture of quiet suffering. Helen is a force of nature, he would say, his hand gently stroking Maya's hair. She doesn't know how to love quietly. Her love is a conquest, a possession. She doesn't see the real you, Maya. She doesn't see the real me either. She only sees what she wants to see. He painted them as two sensitive, artistic souls trapped in a world of cold ambition, finding solace and true understanding only in each other. He fed her poetry and philosophy that romanticized tragic love and rebellion against societal norms. He made their sordid affair feel like a noble, intellectual pursuit, a courageous act of authenticity in a world of phonies. He was not a middle-aged man having an affair with his teenage stepdaughter. He was a misunderstood artist who had finally found his muse. And Maya, desperate to believe in the epic romance, accepted this narrative without question. The deception required a level of duplicity that consumed Maya. She became a brilliant liar, her excuses for her whereabouts, for her sudden drops in grades, for her increasingly withdrawn and secretive behavior, becoming more and more elaborate. She was living two lives: the resentful, sullen teenager in the presence of her mother, and the passionate, adoring woman in the arms of her lover. The constant shifting between these two personas began to warp her sense of self, blurring the lines between truth and fiction. The poisonous covenant between them was solidified on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Helen had organized a lavish garden party, a meticulously planned event designed to showcase her perfect home, her successful husband, and her accomplished daughter. Maya was expected to play the cello for the guests, a command performance that she had come to dread. As she sat on the terrace, her bow moving mechanically across the strings, she watched Mark moving through the crowd, playing the part of the charming host, a smile fixed on his face. She saw him laugh with one of Helen's partners, saw Helen place a proprietary hand on his arm, and a wave of pure, venomous jealousy washed over her. He was hers, not theirs. Later, she found him in his design studio at the back of the property, a small, light-filled space that was his only real sanctuary in the house. He was leaning over a drafting table, but he wasn't working. His head was in his hands, his posture one of utter despair. "I can't do this anymore, Maya," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Living this lie, smiling and shaking hands while all I can think about is you. It's tearing me apart." "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her own heart aching in sympathy. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with a pain that she felt as her own. "I don't know. She would never let me go. And even if she did, she would never, ever let us be together. She would destroy us. She would destroy you. She would see it as the ultimate betrayal, the ultimate failure of her perfect world, and she would make it her life's mission to ruin us." He was right. Helen didn't tolerate failure or betrayal. Her wrath would be swift, total, and devastating. The thought of being separated from Mark, of having him ripped from her life by her mother's fury, was more than Maya could bear. It was a physical pain, a tearing in her chest. "I wish," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish she was just gone." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. It was the first time the thought had been given voice, the first time the dark, formless desire had been given shape. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't recoil in horror. He just looked at her, a strange, calculating light dawning in his eyes. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Sometimes," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur, "the only way to escape a cage is to remove the one who holds the key. We are trapped, you and I, and she is our jailer." It was not a command. It was not even a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, a shared observation that transformed a fleeting, monstrous thought into a viable, terrifying possibility. He was testing her, gauging the depths of her devotion, the lengths to which she would go for him, for them. And in that moment, looking into the eyes of the man she loved, the man she believed was her soulmate, Maya made a silent, deadly vow. She would do anything to be with him. Anything. From that day forward, the nature of their secret conversations shifted. They were no longer just about art and love and escaping their gilded cage. They were about the cage itself, about its architect, and about how one might go about dismantling it. The discussions were always abstract, couched in metaphor and philosophical hypotheticals. They would talk about tragic characters in literature who were driven to extreme acts by love and despair. They would discuss news stories about people who had simply disappeared, leaving their old lives behind. Mark began to subtly plant the seeds of a plan in Maya's fertile, obsessive mind. He started talking about Helen's reliance on sleeping pills, a prescription she used to quiet her relentlessly active mind after stressful days at the office. He would mention, in passing, how she sometimes had a glass of wine to take the edge off. A dangerous combination. "I worry about her," he would say, his brow furrowed with a convincing display of concern. "She's so driven. She doesn't take care of herself. An accident is bound to happen one of these days." He was giving her a method, a narrative, an accidental overdose, a tragic, self-inflicted end for a high-strung, overworked woman. It would be a tragedy, of course, but no one would suspect a thing. They would be free. They could grieve together, console each other, and then, after a respectable amount of time, they could build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Maya seized upon the idea with a chilling, single-minded focus. The guilt and moral conflict that should have accompanied such a monstrous thought were completely eclipsed by her obsession. In her twisted reality, this was not murder. It was a liberation. It was a necessary act to save the great, profound love of her life from being extinguished by a cruel, unfeeling tyrant. She had been a prisoner her entire life, and she was finally being handed the key that was coated in poison. The covenant, which had begun with a kiss, was now being sealed with the unspoken promise of matricide. The transition from a dark, whispered fantasy to a cold, deliberate plan was a slow and insidious process. For Maya, the world took on a strange, hyper-real quality. She felt as if she were moving through a dream, her actions dictated by a script written by a force far greater than herself, the force of her love for Mark. Her mother, once the most powerful and intimidating figure in her life, began to seem fragile, almost pathetic. Maya would watch her across the dinner table, observing her with a terrifying, clinical detachment. She studied her mother's habits, her routines, the precise way she organized her life, not as a daughter, but as a predator studying its prey. The house, once a symbol of her mother's oppressive control, became a chessboard, and Maya began to see the strategic possibilities on the board. She noted the location of the master bathroom where Helen kept her medications. She memorized the dosage on the prescription bottle of sleeping pills. She observed that, on particularly stressful weeknights, Helen would pour herself a single, large glass of Chardonnay and take it to her study, where she would work for another hour before bed. These small, mundane details of her mother's life became the critical components of a developing, Horrific plot. Mark continued to play his part with chilling perfection. He was the concerned husband, the supportive stepfather. He would subtly guide Maya's thoughts, never giving a direct order, but always leading her down the same dark path. "I found Helen's pills on the kitchen counter this morning," he might say, his voice laced with manufactured worry. "She's so forgetful when she's stressed. And she had that big deposition today. I'm sure she'll be exhausted tonight. She'll probably need her wine and her pills just to unwind." He was planting the suggestion, creating the opportunity, and then stepping back, leaving the final, terrible action to Maya. It was a coward strategy, designed to keep his own hands clean while ensuring the outcome he desired. The catalyst that pushed them from planning to action came in the form of a letter. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of a prestigious boarding school in Switzerland. Helen had, without consulting Maya, submitted an application on her behalf for her final year of high school. It was an incredible opportunity, she announced at dinner, her voice bright with a pride that completely ignored the look of devastation on Maya's face. "All the arrangements have been made," Helen said, as if discussing a business merger. "You'll leave in 6 weeks. It will look wonderful on your college applications. Mark and I can visit you in the spring for skiing." 6 weeks. The words slammed into Maya with the force of a physical blow. Switzerland. An ocean away from Mark. It was a death sentence for their love, a permanent and brutal separation. She looked at Mark, her eyes pleading, and saw a flicker of panic in his own before he masked it with a supportive smile. "That's wonderful news, Helen," he said, his voice even. What an amazing experience for Maya. But later that night, he came to her room, his face a mask of anguish. "She's doing this to punish us," he whispered, closing the door behind him. "She must suspect something. This isn't an opportunity. It's an exile. She's sending you away to get you away from me." Whether it was true or just a paranoid fantasy didn't matter. To Maya, it was a declaration of war. Her mother had discovered her one source of happiness, and now she was moving to systematically destroy it. The simmering resentment she had harbored for years erupted into a full-blown, incandescent hatred. Her mother was not just a jailer. She was an executioner. "We have to do something," Maya said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "We can't let her do this." Mark held her, stroking her hair. "There's only one way to stop her, Maya," he said softly, his voice a venomous caress in her ear. "You know that. One way to ensure she can never separate us again." The unspoken had finally been made explicit. The decision was made. The unraveling of Helen Sterling's meticulously ordered world was about to begin. They chose a Thursday. Thursdays were always stressful for Helen. It was the end of her corporate week, filled with last-minute meetings and frantic preparations for Friday's litigation schedules. She would be tired, distracted, and more likely to rely on her nightly ritual of wine and pills. The day itself was torturous. Maya went to school, but the lessons were a meaningless drone. She couldn't focus. Her mind was a chaotic landscape of fear, resolve, and a strange, thrilling sense of impending power. For her entire life, she had been a pawn in her mother's game. Today, she was taking control of the board. She was about to make a move that would change everything. Forever. When she got home, the house was quiet. Mark was out, a deliberate part of their plan. He was establishing an alibi, attending a late afternoon meeting with a client across town, followed by drinks with his colleagues. He wouldn't be home until well after 10 p.m. It had to be Maya and Maya alone. Helen came home just after 7, her face etched with exhaustion. She barely acknowledged Maya, just dropped her briefcase on the floor, kicked off her heels, and headed straight for the kitchen. "Don't bother me for a few hours, Maya," she said, her voice flat. "I have a mountain of paperwork to get through." Maya watched as her mother poured a generous glass of Chardonnay and disappeared into her study, closing the heavy oak door behind her. This was it. Her heart pounding, Maya went to the master bathroom. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely open the medicine cabinet. There was the bottle of pills, just as she knew it would be. She took it, her fingers fumbling with the childproof cap. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The girl staring back at her was a stranger, her eyes wide with a terrifying, feverish light. She was no longer just Maya, the quiet cellist, the budding poet. She was about to become something else entirely. A monster. A matricide. She emptied the contents of the bottle onto a small hand towel. 30 pale blue pills. The recommended dose was 1. 2 at the absolute maximum. She took the towel to her own bathroom and, using the back of a heavy silver hairbrush, a birthday gift from her mother, she began to crush the pills into a fine, silent powder. The rhythmic, grinding sound was the only thing she could hear over the blood roaring in her ears. The next part was the most dangerous. She had to get the powder into her mother's wine. She wrapped the powdered pills in a small tissue and slipped it into her pocket. She went downstairs, her feet silent on the thick carpeting. She stood outside the study door, listening. She could hear the faint rustle of papers, the rhythmic tapping of her mother's pen. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she knocked. "I told you not to disturb me, Maya," Helen's voice called out, sharp and irritated. I just made some tea," Maya lied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I thought you might like some." There was a pause. "Fine," Helen sighed, the sound of her chair scraping back. "Bring it in." Maya pushed the door open. Her mother was at her desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, the wine glass on a coaster beside her. She looked up at Maya, her expression one of pure annoyance. "What is it?" "Nothing," Maya said, her eyes fixed on the half-empty wine glass. I was wondering if we could talk. About Switzerland." It was the perfect bait. Helen's eyes narrowed. "There's nothing to talk about. The decision has been made. It's for your own good." "But I don't want to go," Maya said, letting a tremor of real emotion enter her voice. "This is my home." "Don't be dramatic," Helen snapped. "It's 1 year." As her mother spoke, her attention focused entirely on Maya. Maya's hand moved, swift and sure. She reached for the wine glass as if to move it aside, and in that split second, her other hand, hidden by the motion, tipped the contents of the tissue into the Chardonnay. A few swirls of the glass, a seamless, practiced movement, and the powder dissolved instantly. It was done. She placed the glass back on the coaster. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. "Please, Mom, just reconsider," she pleaded, her performance now fueled by a new, horrifying reality. "The subject is closed, Maya," Helen said, her patience clearly gone. She picked up the wine glass and took a long, deep drink, draining nearly half of what was left. "Now, please, leave me to my work." Maya backed out of the room, her eyes locked on the glass in her mother's hand. She closed the door, her back pressing against the cool wood. She had just served her mother a death sentence. She retreated to her room and waited. It was the longest hour of her life. She tried to read, but the words swam before her eyes. She tried to play her cello, but her hands shook too much to hold the bow. Every tick of the clock was a countdown. At around 9 p.m., she heard a strange, heavy thud from the study below. Silence. She waited another 10 minutes, her body rigid with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. Then, forcing her legs to move, she went downstairs. She knocked on the study door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. With a trembling hand, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The scene inside was one of quiet, domestic horror. Helen was slumped forward in her chair, her head on her desk, nestled amongst the legal briefs. The wine glass lay on its side on the floor, its remaining contents soaked into the expensive Persian rug. One of her arms hung limply, her fingers just inches from the spilled wine. Maya crept closer, her breath catching in her throat. "Mom," she whispered. There was no response. She reached out a shaking hand and touched her mother's shoulder. It was warm, but there was a deep, unnerving stillness to her. She pressed her fingers to her mother's neck, searching for a pulse, just as she had seen in movies. She found nothing. just the cool, unresponsive skin of a body that was no longer alive. The order of Helen Sterling's world had been completely and irrevocably unraveled. Maya stood in the silent study, the smell of wine and expensive paper hanging in the air, and looked at the body of the woman who had given her life. She felt no grief. She felt no remorse. All she felt was a vast, terrifying, and triumphant emptiness. She was free. In the immediate aftermath of her mother's death, a chilling, preternatural calm descended upon Maya. The panic and terror that had threatened to consume her just moments before receded, replaced by a cold, methodical clarity. She was no longer a frightened teenager. She was an actress taking the stage for the most important performance of her life. The script had been written, the scene was set, and now she had to play her part to perfection. Her first thought was the evidence, the empty pill bottle, the silver hairbrush. She moved with a swift, silent efficiency, a ghost in the house of the dead. She ran upstairs, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum against her ribs. She retrieved the pill bottle from her bathroom, wiped it clean of her fingerprints with a tissue, and ran back down to the study. She carefully placed the bottle on the desk near her mother's outstretched hand, close enough to seem plausible, as if Helen had been looking at it before she lost consciousness. She then took the hairbrush, a heavy, ornate object, and wiped it down meticulously before returning it to its usual place on her own vanity. She had to erase herself from the narrative of her mother's death. The next step was the most crucial, the 911 call. She knew she had to sound hysterical, panicked, the distraught daughter who had just made a horrific discovery. She stood over her mother's body, took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, forcing the adrenaline to rise, summoning the tears. She thought of Mark, of their future, of everything she had just risked for them, and the raw emotion she needed came easily. She dialed the number, her fingers fumbling convincingly on the keypad. When the operator's calm voice came on the line, Maya unleashed a torrent of expertly crafted hysteria. "My mother!" she screamed, her voice cracking. I think she's dead. I can't wake her up. Please, you have to help." The words tumbled out, a panicked, incoherent stream. She described the scene, the empty wine glass, the pill bottle, her mother slumped over the desk. She followed the operator's instructions to check for breath, to feel for a pulse, her feigned sobs making her voice almost impossible to understand. "She's not breathing. Oh God, she's not breathing." By the time she hung up, she was genuinely crying, the sheer, overwhelming stress of her monstrous act manifesting as a perfect imitation of grief. The next 10 minutes were an eternity. She waited by the front door, pacing back and forth, wringing her hands, completing the portrait of a daughter in shock. The wail of distant sirens grew closer, a sound that both terrified and reassured her. The authorities were coming. The official process was beginning. Her private, horrific act was about to become a public, tragic event. The first to arrive were the paramedics, their faces grim and professional. They brushed past her, their movements efficient and urgent, but Maya knew it was pointless. They worked on Helen for a few minutes, a somber, silent ritual, before one of them came over to her, his eyes full of a practiced pity. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the words, meant to comfort, were a confirmation of her success. The police arrived next, 2 uniformed officers who separated her from the scene, guiding her into the cold, minimalist living room. They wrapped a coarse blanket around her shoulders and asked her questions in soft, gentle voices. She answered them through her sobs, repeating the story she had rehearsed in her mind. Her mother had been stressed, overworked. She took pills to sleep. She sometimes had a glass of wine. It was a normal Thursday night. She had found her just like this. Each lie was delivered with the unassailable conviction of truth. The house, once a silent testament to order, was now a chaotic hub of official activity. Detectives arrived, followed by the forensics team. The space was filled with the crackle of police radios, the flash of cameras, and the hushed, professional murmurings of people doing their jobs. Maya watched them, a small, trembling figure huddled on the vast white sofa, the epicenter of a tragedy she had created. And then Mark arrived. He had received a call from the police, and he burst through the door, his face a perfect mask of confusion and concern, which quickly morphed into horror as a detective intercepted him. "Mark!" Maya cried out, running to him, and they clung to each other, two conspirators playing their parts in the final, terrible act of their play. His arms around her felt strong, reassuring. "It's okay. It's okay," he murmured into her hair, his voice for the benefit of the officers watching them. But for her, it was a whisper of victory. "We did it." Mark's performance was, if anything, even more brilliant than Maya's. He was the devastated husband, shocked to his core. He answered the detective's questions with a heavy, grief-stricken voice. Yes, Helen had been under a lot of pressure. Yes, he had worried about her mixing her medication with alcohol. He had warned her about it. He painted a vivid, convincing picture of a brilliant but self-destructive woman who had tragically, perhaps accidentally, taken her own life. He never once used the word suicide, but the implication hung in the air, a neat and tidy explanation for the scene in the study. As the hours dragged on, and the coroner's van finally pulled away, taking Helen's body into the cold, impersonal night, a strange new reality began to set in. The house was now officially a crime scene, albeit one where the crime was believed to be self-inflicted. Mark and Maya were told they would have to stay elsewhere for the night. Mark called his sister, his voice thick with a convincing, theatrical grief. Staying at his sister's house was another layer of the performance. They were the bereaved family, clinging to each other for support. They were offered tea and sympathy, their every need catered to by well-meaning relatives who saw only a grieving husband and a shattered daughter. Alone, in the sterile guest room, the facade finally dropped. There were no triumphant declarations, no passionate embraces. They were both too drained, too wired with a nervous, electric energy. "Did they suspect anything?" Mark whispered, his back to her as he stared out the window into the suburban darkness. "No," Maya replied, her voice a hoarse rasp. "They believed me. They believed it was an accident. The pills, the wine. It's exactly like you said it would be." He turned to her then, and for the first time, she saw not the adoring lover or the co-conspirator, but a stranger. His eyes were cold, calculating. "You were good," he said, his voice flat, an appraiser judging a piece of work. "You were very convincing." The compliment, devoid of any warmth, sent a chill down her spine. The "we" who had done this was already beginning to fracture. In the end, it was you who had done it. You were the one who was convincing. The days that followed were a blur of grief-stricken pantomime. There were phone calls to be made, relatives to be informed, a funeral to be planned. Maya and Mark moved through these tasks as a team, their shared secret a silent, unbreakable bond between them. To the outside world, they were a portrait of tragic solidarity. The handsome, grieving widower and the devastated daughter, finding solace in their shared loss. The whispers in the community were all of sympathy. Poor Helen. She had it all, but the pressure must have been too much. It was a tragic, cautionary tale of the pitfalls of success. No one suspected the monster in their midst. The funeral was the grand finale of their performance. The church was filled with Helen's colleagues, clients, and the cream of Northwood society. Maya, dressed in a simple black dress, stood beside Mark, her face pale and drawn, a perfect image of youthful grief. She even managed to summon tears as she placed a single white rose on her mother's casket. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound and overwhelming emotional exhaustion. She had killed her mother, lied to the police, and deceived everyone she knew. The weight of her actions was a physical presence, a heavy cloak she would have to wear for the rest of her life. After the funeral, as friends and family gathered at the house for a somber reception, Maya slipped away. She went to her mother's study. The police tape was gone, and the room had been cleaned, but the ghost of the scene remained. The indentations of the forensic team's equipment were still visible on the carpet. She stood in the center of the room, the place where her mother's life had ended, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. She had gotten everything she thought she wanted. Her mother was gone. The threat of Switzerland was gone. She and Mark were free to be together. But the triumphant liberation she had envisioned felt hollow, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. The house was no longer a cage, but it wasn't a home either. It was a mausoleum, a monument to her terrible secret. Later that evening, after the last of the mourners had departed, Mark found her in the garden, his garden, a space he had created. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming night jasmine. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet. He came and stood beside her, but he didn't touch her. "We're free." Maya looked at him, at the man she had killed for, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the landscape lighting. The passion, the obsession, the epic, romantic love that had fueled her actions seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard residue of fear and complicity. They were not star-crossed lovers. They were murderers, and they were bound together not by love, but by the shared, damning knowledge of what they had done. The performance of grief was over, but a new, lifelong performance was just beginning. The performance of a normal life, built on a foundation of unthinkable horror. The freedom Maya had so brutally purchased was not the glorious, sun-drenched paradise she had imagined. It was a desolate, haunted landscape, shrouded in a perpetual twilight of paranoia and fear. The initial, chilling calm that had carried her through the act of murder and its immediate aftermath dissolved, leaving her nerves raw and exposed. Every creak of the floorboards in the silent, cavernous house sounded like an accusation. Every shadow in a darkened hallway seemed to take the shape of her mother. Sleep became a minefield of horrific, looping nightmares. Her mother's accusing eyes, the sound of pills being crushed, the sickening thud of a body slumping over a desk. She and Mark were finally together, with no one to stand in their way, but the nature of their relationship had been irrevocably altered. The secret that had once been a thrilling, intimate bond was now a toxic, suffocating shroud. They could never speak of what they had done, not even to each other. The act was a silent, monstrous third person in their relationship, always present, always watching. The passion that had been born in stolen glances and whispered conversations withered in the harsh light of their shared crime. When he touched her now, his hands felt cold, and his kisses tasted of ash. To the outside world, their story was a tragic but ultimately heartwarming one. The grieving widower and his stepdaughter, finding comfort and eventually love in the wake of an unspeakable family tragedy. After a respectable period of mourning, nearly a year, Mark and Maya made their relationship public. There were raised eyebrows, of course, whispers of impropriety. But the narrative of their shared grief was a powerful one, and most people, eager to believe in a story of healing and resilience, eventually accepted it. They sold the house on the hill, the gallery of ghosts, and moved to a small, secluded home in a different town, hoping to escape the memories. Mark's landscape architecture business flourished, buoyed by the substantial inheritance Helen had left behind. Maya, instead of going to college, devoted herself to writing, locking herself away for hours, pouring her guilt and anxiety onto the page in the form of dark, tortured poetry that she never showed to anyone. They had the life they had conspired to get, a quiet, private existence where they could be together without judgment. But it was a prison of their own making. The first cracks in their carefully constructed world appeared not from the outside, but from within. Maya, haunted and increasingly unstable, became possessive, her love for Mark curdling into a desperate, paranoid dependency. He was the only person in the world who knew her terrible secret, the only one who shared her guilt. The thought of losing him was a terror far greater than the fear of being caught. She watched him constantly, her jealousy ignited by a casual conversation with a female client or a friendly smile to a waitress. Mark, in turn, began to view her not as his lover and muse, but as a dangerous liability. Her fragility, her nightmares, her constant need for reassurance was all a constant, unwelcome reminder of the crime that tied them together. He had wanted a passionate, liberating affair. He was now shackled to a mentally unstable young woman, who was a living embodiment of his own guilt. He grew distant, cold, spending more and more time at work, seeking refuge from the haunted, suffocating atmosphere of their home. The more he pulled away, the more desperate and possessive Maya became, creating a toxic, spiraling feedback loop of suspicion and resentment. The unraveling from the outside began with a single loose thread. A dogged insurance investigator, reviewing Helen's substantial life insurance policy, noted the unusual circumstances of her death. While the coroner had ruled it an accidental overdose, the sheer quantity of the drug in her system was flagged as an anomaly. It was far more than a simple, drowsy mistake. The investigator started digging quietly, discreetly. He re-interviewed friends and colleagues of Helen's. One of them, a close friend from her law firm, mentioned offhandedly that Helen had been planning to send Maya to school in Switzerland. She had been worried, the friend recalled, about her daughter's unhealthy attachment to her new stepfather. It was a small comment, but it was enough to pique the interest of the local police department, who had always harbored a few quiet, unanswered questions about the case. A quiet, informal inquiry was reopened. A new detective, a man with a reputation for being methodical and relentless, was assigned to look over the old files. He started with Maya. He came to their new house, a polite, unassuming man who introduced himself as Detective Miller. He said he was just tying up some loose ends from the old case for their new digital filing system. His questions were gentle, almost paternal. He asked about her mother, about her relationship with Mark. Maya, her paranoia now a constant companion, was immediately on edge. She recited the well-rehearsed lies, but her answers were brittle, her hands trembling slightly. The detective, trained to notice such things, saw the fear behind her eyes. He then spoke to Mark, who was smoother, more charming, but the detective noted a subtle, yet distinct, tension between him and Maya. They were like two actors who had been playing the same roles for too long, their performances becoming strained and unconvincing. The detective's next move was to subpoena phone records from the weeks leading up to Helen's death. He found what he was looking for: a pattern of hundreds of text messages between Mark and Maya, especially late at night, and an unusually high volume of calls during the times when Helen was out of town. It was circumstantial, but it painted a picture of an intense, clandestine relationship that went far beyond that of a normal stepfather and daughter. The final, damning piece of the puzzle came from the past. Detective Miller tracked down Maya's biological father, the quiet academic her mother had divorced years ago. He asked the man if Maya had ever exhibited signs of emotional distress or duplicity. The father, hesitant at first, eventually admitted that Maya had a childhood history of elaborate, convincing lying to get what she wanted. But then he offered something else, something far more valuable. He had saved a few of the poems Maya had sent him over the years, both before and after Helen's death. The poems from before were filled with teenage angst and a longing for freedom. But the ones from after were different. They were dark, visceral, and filled with haunting, specific imagery. A silent queen on a paper throne, a porcelain cup of bitter wine, a final, quiet closing of a door. It was not a confession. It was art. But for a detective looking for a motive and a guilty conscience, it was a roadmap into the mind of a killer. Armed with the phone records, the friend's testimony, and the poems, the police brought Maya and Mark in for questioning, separating them into two sterile, windowless interrogation rooms. This was the moment their poisonous covenant would be put to the ultimate test. Mark, cool and collected, denied everything. He portrayed Maya as a troubled, infatuated young woman, and himself as the well-meaning stepfather who had tried to maintain appropriate boundaries. He suggested that if Helen had taken her own life, it was perhaps due to the stress of dealing with a difficult, obsessive daughter. He was already beginning to build his lifeboat, preparing to push her overboard. But Maya, under the relentless, probing questions of Detective Miller, began to crumble. He didn't accuse her. He sympathized with her. He spoke of her mother's controlling nature, of her loneliness, of how a man like Mark could have easily taken advantage of a vulnerable young girl. He was offering her a new narrative, a new role to play. Not the cold-blooded killer, but the manipulated victim. For hours, she held on to the lies, to the pact she had made with Mark. But as the detective laid out the evidence against them, the phone calls, the whispers of their affair, the chilling verses of her own poetry, she realized the truth. Mark was not going to protect her. He was going to sacrifice her. The great love, for which she had destroyed her own life, was a lie. He had never been her partner. He had been her puppeteer. The unraveling was total. In a flood of tears, a torrent of rage and self-pity, the entire horrific story came pouring out. She confessed to everything: the planning, the crushing of the pills, the final, terrible act. But she told it just as the detective had suggested, painting herself as the helpless pawn in Mark's twisted, manipulative game. He had put the idea in her head, she sobbed. He had told her it was the only way. She had done it for him, out of love, out of fear. With Maya's confession, the case was sealed. Mark's charm and denials were useless against the detailed, first-hand account of his stepdaughter. They were both arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was a sordid, tragic spectacle. In the end, they were both found guilty. The jury, swayed by Maya's youth and her convincing performance as a manipulated victim, recommended a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole. For Mark, the manipulative mastermind, there would be no such leniency. His sentence was life without parole. As she was led away in chains, Maya looked at Mark one last time. The man she had loved, the man she had killed for, looked at her with nothing but cold, empty hatred. The epic, tragic romance she had constructed in her mind had ended in the most squalid way imaginable. She had escaped her mother's gilded cage only to trade it for a concrete one, where she would spend the rest of her days. Her inheritance was not one of love and freedom, but one of ashes, an empty, desolate ruin of a life she had single-handedly, and for nothing, destroyed.